Hi everyone, thanks for coming to the Rezzed session for Digital Foundry Retro. Now, I want to have a personal thanks to Mr. John Linneman here, who's basically spearheaded the whole DF Retro thing when I thought it probably wouldn't do very well. But the point is that the passion and the personality that John has put into the work has really sort of shone out. He's told really interesting stories, and we thought we'd kind of do something different and try and do it live, and we thought we'd go back to the beginning of the sort of console 3D era.
Exactly.
Saturn versus PlayStation. Now, John was the gamer in that particular era, and I was the journalist. So we thought we'd get two different perspectives on how that all sort of played out. So, John, over to you.
Yeah. So, I mean, around this time, I guess the Mega Drive was huge in Europe. Genesis was huge in America, right? At that time, I think you were working on the Mean Machines magazine?
Yeah, so basically I left school at 18, went straight to work for computer and video games, and at my interview, the first thing I saw was Mega Drive running Afterburner 2.
Oh, yeah.
And I had an Amiga at the time, and it was like, my God, this is a game changer. But yeah, so I worked there for a couple of years, and then on to Mean Machines. And this was when console boom really took off, but it was all 2D. And kind of at the end of that generation, I'd say it was sort of 50-50 between Nintendo and Sega.
Yeah, they were kind of warring it out at that point, right?
Yeah.
But the next generation was kind of on the cusp, I guess you could say. And I think around 93, 94, we started to see systems like the 3DO come in, the Jaguar come in.
Right.
And I think even Sega was concerned with what they were doing, even though they would ultimately kind of go on to fail. But so that kind of resulted in Sega's two-pronged approach, where they were working on the Saturn. But
I was actually on the official Sega magazine at that point. Yeah, so I was actually in the Sega office quite a lot. And I went to see the marketing director very, very occasionally. It was like getting an audience with the emperor. But you always saw really cool things. And this was kind of, we knew that Saturn existed. We didn't know about 32X at that point. But, you go into this kind of Aladdin's cave, and this guy was so enthusiastic about the Sega products. He sort of, he brought out the Nomad, the handheld Mega Drive. This was like a year before it came out. And it's like, whoa, handheld Mega Drive, Sega are going to be the kings forever. And he actually introduced the 32X at that point in kind of like words that were kind of destined to bring about the failure of Sega, really, which was, we've got Saturn, but we've got something else. And I said, okay, so how exciting is it? Because, when you're in this guy's office, everything was sort of judged in scales of excitement. And he said, well, if Saturn's a 10 out of 10, right? Right. This is like an 8 out of 10. And he didn't say anything more about it, and it turned into the 32X.
Yeah.
So where do we go from there?
So, I mean, obviously the 32X came out. It had some interesting ports. You had Virtua Fighter, some of the Super Scalar games, but it kind of died off within a year, right? But I think it was in 1994 is when the Sega Saturn actually released in Japan.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, and then there's the surprise North American launch at that point in 95, where they didn't have very many games and they didn't have all the retail partners lined up. But by this point, also, the PlayStation was out in Japan.
Yeah, now this is we had a discussion about this last night. John was asking me, why did Sony succeed where like the likes of Panasonic and all of these other big TV manufacturers fail? And it was just kind of, they had a point to prove, and they had amazing tech demos, and I think most crucially of all, they had developer buy-in. They were showing developers stuff like that just blew them away completely. And, Sega didn't have anything sort of equivalent.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look at some of the early games, right? Like you had, of course, Daytona USA on the Saturn, but then PlayStation had Ridge Racer. But if you look at where those came from in the arcade, I mean, the PlayStation, or Namco's arcade hardware at that time, was basically a PlayStation, right?
I think the Ridge Racer board was probably quite a bit more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, you had extra memory, a little bit, but it was similar spec, similar type of hardware, whereas Sega had the most powerful arcade hardware on the planet with Model 2, right?
I mean, if you haven't seen John's DF Retro on Daytona, it's amazing because it shows Daytona when it first launched, and the years it took to get an arcade perfect port. It was what 11 years or something crazy like that. That's how far ahead Sega were at the time.
Really cutting edge. So they couldn't obviously bring that home. So I think when you saw Ridge Racer running at 30 frames per second, which, for the time that was great, versus Daytona running at 20 frames per second with a reduced draw distance that looked, I don't want to say nothing, but it didn't really compare to the arcade game. I mean, that kind of set the stage for kind of a disappointment that would run over time. But
well, from my perspective, there were two aspects to it. First of all, there was a hardware advantage that you could see from day one with Ridge Racer. I mean, Ridge Racer was a complete game changer, I think, for home arcade conversions at that point.
Absolutely.
And what happened was, by the time the Western launches came along, it wasn't about Ridge Racer anymore. It was about Wipeout.
That's right.
And this is kind of what I think was the kind of secret sauce that Sony had above the hardware, is that they were actually making games targeted at Western culture for the Western audience, and Sega wasn't quite on the ball to that same degree.
Yeah, they were still very focused on arcade, which it's great to go back to now, but you could see things were shifting at that point.
Yeah, definitely.
But of course, a lot of the troubles really kind of tied up to the development process, because we started to see early on you get a lot of multi-platform games, which is kind of what we, cover a lot of today. And the hardware is very similar. But back then, I mean, the Saturn launched with essentially 2 CPUs, 2 graphics processors, just a very complicated setup, just a ton of chips on the board. The PlayStation with its GTE chip and everything. It was a simple but very capable system.
Yeah, it was more refined. I mean, basically Sega got wind of the PlayStation, realized they needed to concentrate more on 3D, and they kind of piled the chips into the box, and that had two unfortunate effects. First of all, more difficult to program. Secondly, it costs more because they weren't bespoke chips. They had to buy them in. Mm-hmm. And of course, further on down the road, that made it more difficult to actually shrink the box and make it cheaper to produce, which, wasn't a problem for Sony. I mean, if you think of the ultimate iteration of the PS1 as this tiny handheld things, they could never have done that on the Saturn.
No, that's true. Though, I mean, one of the things I think is interesting about that multi-chip design is like what they could do with, say, like the infinite plane system. Right. So, you have VDP 1 and 2, you could do like these large, almost similar, I guess, to like the Mode 7 stuff you see on Super NES, where you could rotate and scale sort of like a large plane. So a lot of Saturn developers would, like on some of the fighting games, they would make the ground and the sky and that kind of stuff just out of an infinite plane, which had none of the texture warping you get on PlayStation, so it actually looked kind of cleaner. And so it required less resources, so they could focus just on the characters, and you get the higher resolution. And so that kind of stuff really impressed, but not everybody was able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, what's kind of fascinating about some of John's DF Retro work on the Saturn in particular is that we kind of saw the games back in the day, but we didn't really understand how they worked. And when you look at the design of the hardware now, where essentially you've got chips that are responsible for, a particular part of the visual makeup.
Right.
So like Virtua Fighter 2 had the high-res 3D visuals at the front, and then all the backgrounds were done by VDP2.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, the VDP2 was basically designed to handle 2D, tile-based stuff. And the VDP1 was doing all the 3D rendering kind of calculations, and it would kind of overlay that into a frame buffer on this VDP2. It made for some pretty interesting results, which is, why multi-platform games sometimes didn't work out, because you couldn't really leverage that. Like with Tomb Raider, Resident Evil, those types of games, I mean, they really relied heavily on VDP1, which was kind of slower than what the PlayStation could do, so you ended up with much lower frame rates and kind of slightly glitchier visuals, and it didn't really work out that well.
VDP2 was basically a 2D chip.
It was pretty much a 2D chip.
It basically ran at 60 hertz throughout.
Yeah.
So you had this kind of curious disconnect between your 3D running at whatever, 20, 30, even 60 frames per second in some cases, but then the background would be at a different frame rate.
Like Nights into Dreams from Sonic Team. I mean, the 2D background is 60 frames per second, but the foreground is 30. So it's like this weird mismatch between the two.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of fascinating to see that this was kind of like the Gen 1 of 3D, really.
Right.
I mean, we had, if you go back and look at what Virtua Racing on Mega Drive was doing and Star Fox,
Super FX stuff,
yeah, it was really kind of grim, wasn't it?
Yeah, very, very slow.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing, of course, is we did have multiplats at the time, but it was actually very rare that they came out simultaneously, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of times they were developed by different studios even, so you'd end up with very strange results. But I think one of the studios best known for pushing the Saturn was Lobotomy Software.
Right.
And you've actually spoken to one of the lead guys there quite a bit, right?
Yeah, his name was Ezra Dreisbach. He was basically the guy who did the 3D engine, and he did Duke Nukem 3D and the astonishing Quake port for the Saturn. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a port of the PC version. They basically had their own engine tailored for the Saturn, and it looked pretty awesome. And they basically had to redevelop the games from the ground up. But they started with Exhumed Power Slave in the US.
Yep. That was a great one.
That was pretty awesome, yeah. And I mean, it's kind of fascinating that multi-platform development was sort of almost on the back burner in the Saturn PlayStation. It was much more about the exclusives, whereas now it's kind of vice versa.
Exactly.
But it is fascinating to see your work, like with Tomb Raider.
Oh, yeah.
But it is interesting to see that the ports were, in many cases, very different games. The Duke Nukem one, tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. The Duke Nukem thing. I mean, Lobotomy did that port. That was their own engine, the same as Power Slave engine, of course. But then on PlayStation, they actually attempted to port the build engine over, which was the PC engine. So they were basically just running it on the CPU.
Yeah, that was again something I learned from one of John's episodes, which was basically that they had this astonishing 3D hardware for the time on PlayStation, but they ran the whole thing on CPU just like they would on the PC.
Which it had the positive impact if you didn't get that horrible texture warping you get on PlayStation, the affine texture mapping. Right. So it actually looked a little more solid, but it ran really, really slow. Uh-huh. But then you had like the N64 port as well, which was also a different thing. And
this is actually a point I was going to bring up last night, which I didn't get around to. But we kind of look at the PlayStation versus Saturn battle, but the N64 was there as well.
Yeah, that's right.
And it was there for most of the generation, wasn't it? It was a little later. I remember I was working on Maximum at the time, a multi-format magazine, and that we stopped doing that. And then I had like about a month or two off before I moved on to the Saturn mag. And that was the point where the N64 launched in Japan. We had a lottery. We had 2 units coming in. We had a lottery as to who would buy them. And I was one of the lucky people to get the N64, but it was such a very different system.
It really was. I mean, that one was focused entirely on 3D,
right,
and a different style of 3D, which is kind of interesting because reading some interviews back with Tom Kalinske, who was the I guess president of Sega of America back in the early 90s. He was the guy that spearheaded everything there. SGI had come to Sega basically with hardware similar to what they proposed to Nintendo for the N64. But because of that split between Sega of Japan and Sega of America, it never really panned out because Sega of Japan just had no interest in working with non-Japanese, non-Sega developed hardware. So I think it kind of would have been interesting to see what would have happened if that partnership had come to fruition as opposed to what we ended up with.
Yeah, I mean, looking back in time, I remember, we had the Saturn magazine pretty much right next to the Nintendo magazine. And they didn't have anything to show for months. They had the Cruising USA, Coin-Op, and Killer Instinct.
That's right.
But beyond that, they had nothing except the promise of Silicon Graphics workstations. Yeah. So, every month in the mag, you'd see like Terminator 2 renders and stuff like that. And you think, whoa, Nintendo are going to rule.
Yep.
Yeah, then you get the kind of the reality, project reality even.
So during your tenure then at the magazine, so what were the games that hit for you that really impressed on a technical level where you were just like, oh man, this is what the Saturn is doing here really stands out?
I think the Panzer Dragoon games were pretty awesome. I mean, they were tailored specifically for that hardware. They weren't ports; they were built from the ground up for the hardware.
Plus, a fun fact: Panzer Dragoon 2 has a 16:9 widescreen mode, which is kind of a cool little fact, I think.
Wow.
Not many games back then did.
Were there any 16:9 TVs at the time?
Maybe.
But yeah, I mean, that was one of the few games I think that was actually built from the ground up for the hardware that we actually saw. A lot of the time they were arcade ports, which, you know, it was Sega's currency at the time.
Panzer would have actually been kind of impossible on the PlayStation because that's one of the games that used the infinite plane system. So you could basically do like a massive flat area and then fill that with polygons. So the game could like soar along these huge open zones that just... the amount of triangles that would take on a PlayStation, it would have been much too slow, or you would have had like a massively reduced draw distance. I don't think it would have worked very well at all.
Right. Yeah, I think, you know, working on the Saturn magazines, it was very much a case of siege mentality almost, because the longer you worked on it, the more the PlayStation was getting dominant, and the more you were seeing bespoke games, not just from aimed at the Western audience, but stuff like Metal Gear Solid, which was...
Oh, yeah, of course.
You know, Sega didn't really have any answer to that at that point. And the arcade ports, the problem there, of course, was that they were actually getting more and more advanced in the arcades. They moved from Model 2 to Model 3. Saturn was still where it was. And then you sort of start to hear all these rumors about the next console, but also new hardware that would plug into the Saturn's memory port, and we'd get Virtua Fighter 3.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of a rumor going around, and I don't think it's ever really been fully answered, but that there was Virtua Fighter 3 in development for Saturn.
Yeah, well, we know that Shenmue was in development for Saturn.
Of course, yeah, we've seen that.
In your Shenmue DF Retro video.
They released that video. Yep, that was cool.
But there's a lot of sort of rumors, urban myths about Virtua Fighter 3 on the Saturn, and yeah, I kind of wanted to get to the bottom of this about 6 months ago, I think, because I know somebody who used to be in the middle of things at Sega who would have known. There's lots of sort of forum threads that I was reading about how they actually started work on VF3 on the Saturn, then they stopped work, then they started it again, this sort of thing. So I went to the guy who, you know, he was at the center of things at Sega, and I said, look, what actually happened? And he said, I never saw anything. And then he said, it was never on any release schedule. So I kind of think Occam's razor would suggest that it didn't exist, and what we got was Fighters Megamix, which
yes, that was something.
Did have a lot of VF3 in it, movesets and
it was a cool game.
Stages, that's something like that.
But I think at that point, though, I mean, that's when we were heading into like '98, where the Dreamcast was kind of becoming a thing. And for me, I mean, I was just reading about this in magazines and catching occasional videos online, but you were there basically.
Yes. Yeah, I've told this story several times. Yeah, John came over to stay for a while, and he was reading through the old Saturn mags. And he said, oh, wow, you went to the New Challenge conference. That was the Sega reveal for the Dreamcast. And he said, you met the president of Sega. And I was like, no, I didn't. He goes, yeah, no, you did. And I said, no, I didn't. He said, yeah, you did. Look, here's a picture. And it's kind of, this is how long ago it is that there's so much that I just don't remember about the whole era. And there it was, evidence that I did actually meet the president of Sega, and I didn't remember it whatsoever. But thinking back to it, yeah, it was a kind of press roundtable. And I remember that because there were several sessions, and Yuji Naka, the creator of Sonic, was very, very unhappy with one particular publication who'd leaked Sonic Adventure stuff ahead of time. It was like
a French publication or something?
I won't name names because primarily I can't remember them. But yeah, that was actually really interesting because Sega had so much to prove after the Mega Drive, and when you think back to how good the Dreamcast was.
Yeah, it was an amazing system.
And it was ahead of the PS2. And they really wanted to right a lot of wrongs, I think, with that piece of hardware. And, it, you know, when you look at it, it is a really elegant...
Yeah, it's really, really well designed. I mean, it was like the antithesis of the Saturn with like a very streamlined motherboard design and like really nice chip selection. And it was really, really fast for the time. I mean, it came out in 1998 in Japan, right? So... I mean, it wasn't perfect, but the port of Virtua Fighter 3 at launch, I mean, seeing that on a home console, that was incredible.
Yeah, yeah. There was a lot of good stuff there, and we had the promise of Shenmue as well, the Project Barclay reveal.
Yeah, that's right.
And they were continuing the arcade stuff as well, so they had arcade boards built on Dreamcast hardware, essentially.
Oh, yeah, that's right, the Naomi stuff. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, they were directly doing arcade games and home games using the same hardware. which did actually exist for the Saturn as well with the STV board, which was just a Saturn, but that was, that really trailed behind the Model 2 and Model 3, so not a big deal.
So how close was that VF3 port? Bearing in mind AM2 didn't even do it, did
Right,
they?
I think it was done by Genki, which did like the Tokyo Extreme Racer games and whatnot. It was relatively close from what I recall, but it was missing a few minor details on the character models and a few little reductions here and there. Maybe I need to do an episode on that sometime, look back at it closely, but you still got that sensation that it was arcade perfect, even if it wasn't. Versus, Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn was an amazing port, but it didn't really look like the Model 2 game, right? So it was the first time we were really getting like that arcade cutting edge 3D at home.
Yeah, I mean, we were having a debate about how successful the Dreamcast was, because you essentially put forward the theory that Sega just ran out of money, but it could have competed against the PS2.
I mean, I don't think it would have ever, taken over what the PS2 would go on to do, but I think if maybe they had a little bit more money in their coffers, they could have actually held out for a little longer, or a lot longer even, because it was a nice machine and there was a lot of good software on it.
Yeah, and they had that year's head start, really. And
they did.
What I was doing towards the end of the Saturn magazine era was to actually take that hardware into shops and see what gamers thought of it, which was quite an interesting exercise.
Cool.
And it was, it was cool, but it highlighted the issue that Sega had. People came in, they saw the games, they saw like Sonic Adventure, and it's like, wow, this is really good. But then it was always, but I've got a PlayStation and I kind of want to know what Sony are going to be doing with PS2. And they knew it was around the corner.
Exactly.
And the fact that they knew it was around the corner, they could probably wait that year, because they, the volume of PlayStation games that was still happening was immense.
Yeah, they were still coming out. I mean, in North America, for instance, the day the Dreamcast launched, Square put out Final Fantasy VIII, the exact same day. I mean, that's kind of not a great move.
Yeah, but it kind of highlights just the power of the library that they had and the developer support they had by that point. And it really was, I think the PS1 really was like a cultural phenomenon at that point.
Yeah, it definitely was.
There's just holdouts like me holding onto the Saturn and...
I think some of the last days of the magazine were really interesting. Like looking back at it, like so you did demo discs with the magazine, and they were usually produced by Sega.
They were all produced by Sega.
Yeah, they were all produced by Sega. But one of the last demo discs in the magazine was the first disc of Panzer Dragoon Saga. So like the first disc, you could play it, you could save your game, and if you bought the full game, you'd actually just pick up from there. And just that idea is nuts to me.
Yeah, I mean, the big issue that we had with demo discs was that we didn't have enough of them, whereas the official PlayStation magazine, every month, bang, 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 demo disc, demo disc, demo disc. And it was a massive driving factor for them, to the point where the success of that PlayStation 1 magazine was so huge that they could essentially float their company on the success of the official PlayStation magazine. It was doing huge things. I mean, we were doing like maybe 30, 40,000 copies a month if we were lucky. They were doing 400,000, which kind of highlights the gulf. The demo disc side of things, we weren't getting enough demo discs, but then Panzer Dragoon Saga came along, and it was 4 discs. And the actual content on the first disc, I mean, you can finish it in like 40 minutes, can't you, pretty much?
Yeah, I mean, it's not especially long because they loaded it with full motion video, but still, I mean, it's a decent chunk of the game.
Yeah.
And just the novelty of saying, you got the first disc of the game included in your magazine, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I actually pitched that to Sega and said, look, this could be really cool, and you're not giving so much of the game away. And they surprisingly went for it. And kind of what surprises me in particular was that Sega of Japan made all of the calls at that point. They were kind of fully in charge in terms of key decisions like this. So, it kind of speaks to the passion of the Sega Europe guys that they were able to pitch this and get it signed off, and we actually made it happen. And that was pretty amazing.
That's really cool stuff.
But kind of in common with the game itself, the actual sales of the magazine weren't so big, if I recall, on that one.
And I think in the end, the magazines kind of ended up finishing off with a lot of Dreamcast coverage, right? I mean, the last cover was Dead or Alive 2?
Yeah, I think the last PAL Saturn release was Deep Fear. But beyond that, I think that might have been reviewed in the last issue, I'm not sure. But beyond that, everything was Dreamcast, you know, everything, that was what people were geared up for, really excited for, and, you know, certainly where we wanted to continue.
And, you know, one thing about, you know, Dreamcast that was cool at the time, I think, so being from North America, we were used to 60 hertz, right? NTSC versus PAL. And I think with the PlayStation and Saturn, they were still mostly targeting just, you know, 50 hertz, right?
Yep.
Whereas the Dreamcast, I think, came out with native support for VGA out of the box. So you had 60 hertz games across the board.
That's right, yeah. I mean, it was kind of very forward-thinking in that regard.
Absolutely.
Similar to Xbox, I think, was you could do something similar on that.
I think so. PlayStation 2, though, a lot of 50 hertz still.
Yeah, not good. It's kind of like something I'm very happy to leave in the past.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that's kind of where we're going to leave it for now. Just wondered whether you guys had any questions about that era? Anyone?
Well, we have a mic.
You get your own mic.
What about the online capability of the Saturn?
Yeah, well,
was it ever explored really as to a point where it came like the Dreamcast, for example, where you got the broadband adapter and things like that? Do you think if the Saturn had things like a broadband adapter or something at high speed equivalent, do you think it could have kept going?
There was a Saturn online thing.
Yeah, they did the Netlink, I think, on the Saturn, right? Which, and I mean, it didn't really do that well. There weren't a lot of games that supported it. I mean, I think there was like Sega Rally Netlink Edition.
Wasn't there like an enhanced Daytona or something on it? Or
I think so, actually. There might have been that as well. So, I mean, Sega had tried online gaming before, and then when the Dreamcast hit, of course, it was also modem-based, right? They did have a broadband adapter. That was cool. But I think it was still a little bit too early for online gaming at that point. I mean, even the Dreamcast was just at the point where it was kind of viable. But I think in the Saturn era, not everybody had access to the connection necessary to play games.
On Dreamcast was epic.
Yeah, that was a big deal, obviously.
Yeah.
Cool.
All I wanted to say is, obviously, back in the year between PlayStation and Sega, I was very young. And what I find funny is I was totally oblivious to all this warring going on. So it's so interesting to sort of now, I'm a lot older, I'm in my 30s. I find it fascinating to look back and see like the struggle people like yourselves had to put up with just so kids like me could just sit there and play games. There was no rivalry in my eyes. I just went from good game to good game and had a blast. So
that's the way to go.
Yeah, a sort of a more innocent, happier time, I think. But even at that point, there were titles on PlayStation like Wipeout and Destruction Derby and Resident Evil. It was a really big deal when they came onto the Saturn.
Yep.
Wasn't so many vice versa, was there?
Ooh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, Exhumed Power Slave did end up going to PlayStation, but not too many others, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing, of course, is that a lot of those a lot of the PlayStation games, Saturn games, they were exclusive, These days, it's entirely the other way around, where the multiplats dominate the release schedule, and, you would have, like, first-party exclusives, certainly from Sega, like at least every other month, it seemed like, anyway.
Yeah, it definitely seemed that way.
Yeah, there's a lot of material. I mean, I think a lot of the other reasons that Sega were finding things difficult was because the sheer volume of platforms they had to deal with at that point.
That was really difficult for them.
Yeah, there was, the Mega Drive, even in the earlier days, the Mega Drive, the Master System, the Game Gear.
And then the Mega CD.
Then the Mega CD. And then
32X.
The 32X, the 32X and the Mega CD.
That's right.
and then the 32X, and then the Saturn. I mean, I would suggest that resources were kind of stretched there. I also think there was a big cultural divide between Sega of America and Sega of Japan.
Oh, yeah.
They were all in on Saturn. They really didn't put much time into the 32X, and I think they were kind of right to do that.
Yeah, it shouldn't have existed.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm over here. I'm just amazed because of Sega's issues and because it wasn't really much of a competition, why you didn't look more into the N64 versus the PlayStation, which was actually a bit more of a real battle, whereas Sega just.
I think even there,
dominated.
it was still a huge first-party divide, and there weren't so many multiplats between.
Yeah, I mean, the N64 was kind of its own thing, right? I mean, you did have some multi-platform games, But in general, I feel like the N64 was very focused on a specific type of 3D game, often produced by Nintendo or one of its close developers. So they kind of did their own thing off to the side, whereas I feel like Saturn and PlayStation were more directly attempting to compete, at least until the Saturn failed there. But, you know...
Yeah, N64 though, I mean, incredible machine in many ways.
At the time, yeah, but I actually think it's aged a little bit worse than the others because I'm serious, if you look back at a lot of... It has, but if you look at its best games, especially some of the 2D stuff or the simple 3D games, you get really high frame rates, right? There's still a lot of 60 frames per second games on Saturn and PlayStation, but on N64, there's like F-Zero X, and that's it. So there's just a lot of low frame rates there. So to me, it feels a little chunky.
Bit of controversy there, John.
How much of an impact do you think not having a Sonic 3D platformer or platformer in general made an impact?
A Sonic 3D platformer?
Would have made an
Sonic
impact.
Extreme.
Oh, the Sonic Extreme situation. Well, I mean, we've seen some of the prototypes come out of what Sonic Extreme was becoming, and I'm not sure that specific game would have made a huge impact, but I do think if they had a real Sonic game early on the Saturn, when Sonic was still like almost infallible at that point, I actually do think that would have made a pretty big difference. Because, I mean, there was still a lot of mascot platforming and action happening on even the PlayStation. I mean, there was Crash, Spyro the Dragon, that kind of stuff. Those were very successful titles.
I think one thing you have to really give credit to Nintendo for was that they actually made the transition for the mascot characters into 3D.
Yeah, I mean,
much
Mario
more
64
effective.
was...
Yeah, you know, and they made new
stuff,
new characters, new mascots for their platform there, and that was quite remarkable. And have we actually ever seen a 3D Sonic game that stands up to the quality of the original?
I would argue that Sonic Generations gets pretty close.
Right.
But that's possibly the only one.
Yeah. I mean, it's not easy. I mean, that's kind of what Nintendo did so well with Mario 64. They actually, they had to rewrite everything from the ground up, really, to make that work.
That's right. I mean, one of the things with Sonic that would have made it difficult back then is that Sonic was so fast that the hardware wasn't really designed to handle 3D levels to be traversed at that speed, right? You'd need a huge map to do it. Whereas Mario was kind of a slower paced game, and they slowed it down with Mario 64 even, so that it just kind of worked out better.
Yeah,
so
it was also quite vertical as well.
Yeah, there was a lot of verticality and climbing and whatnot. So I think Sonic would have... I actually do think Sonic Mania is kind of what I would have expected from like a 2D Saturn Sonic game in a way.
Yeah, we're really excited. Well, we are really excited about that one.
Yeah, I am excited about that.
Yeah, definitely. Any more questions?
You actually just answered it. I was about to say the game next door is what we should have had on Sega Saturn.
I agree.
Yeah,
100% with you on that.
Yeah.
It's written by the guy who did the mobile ports. Is that right?
Yeah, Christian Whitehead. He's been in the Sonic demo scene and fan scene for a while. Like, he does amazing work.
But it is kind of ironic that he's the guy they went to recapture the spirit of Sonic, really.
I think he knows better than anybody in Sega today.
Pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much an open question to Richard on this. So let's say you could turn back time and be in the days of Sega still. What would you do to make the Saturn succeed now?
That's a difficult one because fundamentally the issue was hardware design, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
It limited so much in what they were able to do. And if you think about Sega's design choices at the time, they were perfectly valid. You know, they'd had mega success in the 2D side of things. And they kind of were planning to extend that onto the Saturn with kind of like a liberal dose of 3D. But again, you know, at the same time, they kind of should have seen it coming because, you know, their arcade guys were pushing the envelope.
Yeah, that's always kind of the sticking point for me is, I mean, you see what AM2 and their other studios were doing in the arcade, and I just can't understand how they didn't look at that and say, this is the kind of thing we need to do, with the only line of thinking being maybe at the time arcades were still so profitable, they were like, well, we need to have our arcade experience and we need to have our home experience. But other than that, I'm not really sure.
Yeah. But yeah, what could they have done? You know, that's a difficult one, sort of. go back in time and make some key decisions about the arcades and viability of 3D hardware, I think.
Yep.
So I think we've got time for one more.
Thanks. On the Dreamcast, there was a game called Choo Choo Rocket that they released right at the end. They gave it away for free, and I always wondered whether that was a last-ditch attempt to drum up interest or whether it was just a middle of defeat. Just give it away to the fans. What do you
I
think?
honestly don't know, but I do think they needed to have a title that would promote the online aspects. And it was a great game, right? So that was probably a good call.
And Choo Choo Rocket was definitely a good one for that. But I mean, that was Sonic Team, just as Phantasy Star Online was, and both of them had online modes. So it seems like Sonic Team was really trying to push this whole online kind of experience at the time.
Mm-hmm, definitely. There was one more guy there who had his arm up. Yeah.
How do you think that Sega of America went from having a lot of influence during the 16-bit era to having, say, almost no influence during the 32-bit era? Because I think when you hear Tom Kalinske talk, Sega of Japan didn't really agree with a lot of the decisions to do with the Genesis, but let them do it anyway. But then that situation seemed to change quite quickly. So how do you think that happened?
I think you've probably looked into this more than I have, John, but I think the bottom line is the fact that the 32X existed at all is entirely down to Sega of America's influence.
Yeah, I mean, there was always this sense that the Japanese staff kind of resented what they were doing in America, and it kind of feels to me that they were essentially looking for any point where Sega of America would trip up. So as soon as they make a mistake, they can quickly say, oh, well, you failed here, we're taking control back from you.
But Kalinske had some massive wins, didn't he? Like you were telling me about the Sonic pack-in.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the whole Sonic 1 pack-in with the Genesis, I mean, Japan didn't want to do that. They didn't want to give away their best game with the hardware, but that's what Nintendo would go on to do with the Super NES with Mario World, and it was a huge, huge win, and they got a ton of sales out of that. So, real quick, though, before we go, who here owned a Sega Saturn? All right.
Okay, PlayStation?
PlayStation? Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's about right.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap things up there.
Yeah.
So thanks for that, John. And thanks, everyone, not just for coming here, but also for supporting us on YouTube, Eurogamer, and keeping up with DF Retro. So
yes,
thanks
thank you very
to
much.
you guys. Thank you.